The jungle at night was alive, but not with human sounds. Rain drummed softly against a canopy of black leaves, mingling with the steady hum of insects and the distant croak of unseen frogs. Somewhere beneath that shroud of darkness, the 25th Infantry Division of the United States Army crept through the mud of Guadalcanal. Their boots sank silently into the earth, their rifles held tight to their chests. Every breath felt borrowed, every step deliberate. Ahead of them, unseen but close, were Japanese patrols, tired, hungry, and convinced that the Americans could not possibly move through the dense jungle without torches, guides, or trails. Yet the Americans were already behind them, ghost-like, unseen, unheard. One Japanese diary later found in a burned-out foxhole contained a single chilling line. "We fought shadows that bled." It was the night of December 12, 1942. The Japanese army had been on Guadalcanal for nearly half a year, their early confidence dissolving in the endless damp of the tropics. They had expected a quick victory to drive the Americans back into the sea. Instead, they found themselves hunted. Soldiers whispered of invisible snipers, of attacks coming from the darkness and disappearing just as suddenly. A mortar shell would land among them, killing 3 or 4 men, yet no muzzle flash could be seen. Panic spread through the ranks. To them, it was as if the enemy had merged with the jungle itself. The Imperial Command in Tokyo dismissed these accounts as battlefield superstition, but officers on the ground knew better. Something had changed in the way the Americans fought. The change had begun months earlier, not on the front lines, but in the minds of men like General Alexander Patch and Colonel Robert Hall. They understood that the Japanese soldier, disciplined and fanatical, relied on predictable movement, charging positions, shouting battle cries, and trusting numbers and courage over flexibility. But the Americans were learning to disappear. They trained in silence, using hand signals and camouflage nets made from palm fronds. Their uniforms were stained with mud and grease to break their outlines. Marine engineers had retooled lightweight gear for humid conditions, waterproof ammo belts, machetes balanced for single-handed swings, and mosquito nets coated with repellent developed by Army chemists at Fort Detrick. Even rations were redesigned, small, high-calorie tins that didn't rattle or smell when opened. Bit by bit, the Americans became something new, soldiers who could fight where there were no roads, no sky, and no light. A Japanese reconnaissance patrol near the Matanacar River discovered this transformation the hard way. At dawn, they spotted what looked like an abandoned American camp. Fires still smoldered. Tin cups and spent cartridges littered the ground. Believing they'd found a retreating unit, they advanced. Moments later, a concealed Browning automatic rifle opened up from the undergrowth. The lead scout fell instantly, and by the time his comrades hit the dirt, grenades were already rolling through the foliage. When the smoke cleared, only 2 survivors remained, both shell-shocked, their uniforms shredded. When interrogated days later by their own officers, they claimed they had been attacked by spirits who vanished in the trees. The Americans had used sound itself as a weapon, short bursts of gunfire, immediate silence, then movement to a new angle before the enemy could locate them. For the first time, the Japanese encountered an opponent who refused to fight by the book. Their own tactics, frontal assaults, banzai charges, and night infiltration, had once terrified Chinese and British troops. But on these humid battlefields, where vision ended 10 feet away, courage alone meant nothing. American units now fought in hunter-killer teams of 6 to 10 men each, carrying carbines, knives, and flamethrowers. They moved in pairs, one man covering while the other advanced, blending into the ferns. Their faces were painted black and green, their helmets wrapped in vines. A captured soldier later reported to his officer that he never saw the Americans coming. Only the glint of eyes, a whisper in the dark, and then the world exploded. To him, it wasn't war anymore. It was haunting. Behind this eerie transformation was not just training, but adaptation. American engineers from the Quartermaster Corps developed moisture-resistant weapon grease that prevented rifles from jamming in tropical rain. Infantry specialists modified the M1 Garand's gas system to fire reliably in the heat. Radio operators used short-range handsets, SCR 536 handy-talkies, which allowed patrols to coordinate silently over short distances. Even medics adjusted, carrying sulfur-based powders and lightweight stretchers woven from bamboo. Every ounce of equipment reflected the hard lessons of the jungle. Move light, strike fast, vanish instantly. Japanese soldiers, burdened by heavier gear and rigid orders, could not adjust quickly enough. To them, the Americans seemed to possess impossible speed. By early 1943, the campaign in the Solomons had turned into a nightmare of confusion for the Japanese command. Reports described phantom attacks, where entire platoons vanished without firing a shot. Supply lines were shredded by ambushes. Scouts sent to trace enemy positions returned with tales of movement in the fog, of shapes that appeared and dissolved. These stories were dismissed as fear-talking, until reconnaissance flights confirmed the aftermath: burned supply dumps, overturned trucks, scattered dead. In one particularly brutal raid near Mount Austin, a Japanese ammunition column was destroyed without a single gunshot being heard. Only later did it become clear that the Americans had used grenades rigged with tripwires, detonated remotely through field telephone lines. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese diaries recovered after the campaign painted a picture of disintegration. They move like ghosts, one entry read. We hear whispers and gunfire, but never see the enemy. For men taught that honor came from direct confrontation, the new enemy was incomprehensible. They were fighting shadows, and shadows could not be killed. Even experienced officers began to show cracks. Captain Hiroshi Tanaka, a decorated veteran of China, reportedly told his men before a night patrol, "If we die, it will be by something we cannot see." That night, his entire unit was annihilated by a silent ambush. His body was found days later, machete in hand, his eyes open, his expression fixed somewhere between rage and disbelief. The Americans, the transformation felt just as strange. They were learning to fight on instinct, to read the forest as an ally rather than an obstacle. The jungle that had once terrified them now concealed them. Soldiers joked that they were turning native, but in truth, it was evolution. The terrain demanded it, and survival rewarded it. Officers stopped relying on maps. Trees moved, rivers flooded, and trails vanished overnight. Instead, scouts learned to navigate by scent, by bird calls, and by the direction of moss on bark. What began as improvisation became doctrine. When word of these new jungle tactics reached other Allied commands, it spread quickly. Australian and New Zealand forces adapted similar methods in New Guinea. Training camps in Hawaii and Samoa began running specialized jungle schools, teaching camouflage, silent communication, and ambush psychology. The old image of the loud, visible American soldier was gone. In its place stood a ghost, a quiet, relentless predator who struck from the dark and left no trace. For the Japanese still trapped on Guadalcanal, that realization came too late. As the campaign drew to a close in February 1943, the remnants of their army tried to retreat along the coast. Many never made it. American patrols were already there, cutting off escape routes, melting back into the forest before dawn. When Imperial headquarters finally ordered evacuation, only a fraction of their original force was left alive. The rest had vanished into the mud, the rain, and the silence that followed. But what the Japanese soldiers could not comprehend, and what their commanders refused to admit, was that they had been defeated not by superior numbers or firepower, but by adaptation. The Americans had learned to fight an invisible war in an invisible world. And somewhere in that steaming jungle, amid the wreckage of burned trucks and the smell of cordite, a single question hung heavy in the air: that if ghosts could bleed, could they also win a war? The secret behind America's jungle dominance wasn't mystical. It was mechanical, methodical, and born from desperation. In 1942, while Japan's army boasted of Bushido spirit and infantry precision, American engineers and soldiers quietly dismantled the myth that courage alone could win a war. They replaced bravado with ingenuity and ritual with adaptation. What the Japanese mistook for ghosts were men who had mastered the art of blending technology with nature. Men who understood that in the jungle, the environment was both weapon and shield. At the heart of this new warfare lay innovation. The Quartermaster Research Laboratories in Philadelphia began developing uniforms coated with a paraffin-based waterproofing compound that resisted mildew and heat rot. Technicians modified saws with softer rubber that gripped slick mud without leaving deep prints. These small changes allowed American soldiers to move silently through foliage while Japanese troops, wearing heavier leather boots, slogged noisily at every step. The difference in sound became a tactical advantage. Patrols from the U.S. Army's 25th Division noted that they could identify enemy positions by noise alone while remaining virtually undetectable themselves. Engineers in Hawaii worked to redesign helmets. Adding canvas covers dyed in irregular greens to match jungle light, a subtle shift, but one that erased the last gleam of metal the Japanese scouts relied upon. Then came the tools of communication, the unseen thread binding these ghosts together. Motorola's SCR 536 handy-talkie allowed small squads to coordinate ambushes and withdraw silently. For the first time, dispersed patrols could move independently without losing synchronization. Japanese intelligence had no countermeasure. Their field radios were bulky and easily jammed, and their signals traveled only half as far. American radiomen operated on frequencies fine-tuned to avoid interference from jungle humidity, a breakthrough credited to young technician Henry Magnuson at the Signal Corps Laboratory in New Jersey. His modified frequency coils became the invisible lifeline of every patrol. To the Japanese, it seemed like sorcery, squads attacking from multiple angles in perfect timing, yet no bugles, no messengers, no shouted orders. It was precision born from circuitry, weapons evolved too. The M1 Garand, already superior in fire rate, was altered for the climate. The Springfield Armory replaced certain steel components with phosphate coatings resistant to corrosion. Soldiers learned to wrap rifle bolts with oil-soaked cloth during monsoon nights to prevent rust. Grenades were redesigned with shorter fuses for close-quarters combat. Flamethrowers were fitted with smaller nitrogen tanks for easier movement through vines and roots. These weren't random field tweaks. They were innovations filtered from frontline feedback through an industrial machine that never slept. American factories listened to their soldiers. In Akron, Ohio, Goodyear produced waterproof cartridge belts. In New York, General Electric built lighter generator packs for field radios. The ghosts in the jungle had engineers behind them. The Japanese noticed the difference. After a series of ambushes along the Numa Numa Trail on Bougainville in late 1943, captured survivors reported confusion unlike anything they had faced before. They were invisible, one survivor said during interrogation. We fired where they had been, but the jungle swallowed them. Imperial officers wrote that the Americans seemed to anticipate every movement, as if guided by spirits. They weren't wrong about guidance. It came from aerial reconnaissance linked to ground scouts through encoded radio bursts. Spotter planes transmitted target coordinates in real time to forward patrols. These coordinates, received on modified and /PRC sets, allowed soldiers to maneuver without maps. It was a networked battlefield before the term existed, but no technology mattered more than the human element, the training that turned ordinary men into spectral hunters. Jungle Warfare School in Oahu became a crucible. Recruits learned to march 15 miles through mud without a compass, to eat what they could find, snakes, roots, fruit fallen from trees, and to move in absolute silence. They trained at night, using moonlight as their only guide. A typical exercise began with a single rule: if an instructor could hear you breathe, you failed. By 1944, graduates of these schools were being deployed to New Guinea, Burma, and the Philippines. Their Japanese counterparts, still trained for open-field warfare and mountain assaults, could not comprehend an enemy who fought like the forest itself. The battle that cemented this transformation unfolded on Bougainville in March 1944. The U.S. 14 Corps advanced through impenetrable jungle toward the Piva Forks, where Japanese forces under General Kanda held a network of dugouts and machine gun nests. The terrain was suffocating: dense bamboo, swampy ground, and vines thick as cables. Visibility rarely exceeded 10 meters. At dawn, the Americans began their approach. Instead of charging, they melted forward in silence. Scouts carrying machetes cleared paths only inches wide, while riflemen followed, ice sweeping the undergrowth. When Japanese machine guns opened fire, they hit empty foliage. Within seconds, return fire came from their flanks. Entire gun crews fell without seeing who had shot them. The Americans advanced not as a wave, but as a tide, slow, deliberate, inevitable. Radio coordination allowed artillery support to strike within yards of the front line. Spotters crouched beneath ferns, whispering coordinates into microphones barely larger than a matchbox. Within minutes, 105 shells whistled overhead, smashing bunkers hidden by roots. When the shelling ceased, silence returned, broken only by the soft footfall of boots through leaves. In captured Japanese reports, one lieutenant wrote that the Americans move without sound or form. The forest itself attacks. That perception wasn't entirely wrong. The U.S. troops used flamethrowers to ignite dry palm fronds, creating walls of smoke and confusion. Under that cover, they flanked positions using narrow animal trails invisible on maps. By nightfall, Piva Forks was gone, burned, shattered, overrun. The Japanese defenders who survived staggered into the jungle, disoriented. Many fired at shadows or even each other. American casualties were light, less than 100 dead in a fight that wiped out nearly 2,000 enemy troops. To the survivors, it seemed supernatural. Word spread that American soldiers could see in the dark, that their rifles never jammed, and that they vanished into trees when wounded. In truth, it was logistics, science, and relentless adaptation. The very things the Imperial Command had dismissed as unimportant compared to spiritual discipline. Even psychological warfare found its place. Propaganda units broadcast distorted jungle sounds through loudspeakers. Crickets mixed with human whispers, distant rifle clicks echoing in unnatural rhythms. The Japanese, already on edge, fired blindly into the forest, exposing their positions. This tactic, devised by intelligence officer Merrill McBride, became known as night weaving. It turned the enemy's imagination into an ally. By manipulating sound, the Americans deepened the illusion of omnipresence. The jungle itself became an accomplice. What frightened the Japanese most wasn't death, it was the loss of understanding. Their doctrine promised that discipline could overcome any obstacle. But against an enemy who rewrote the rules, discipline became a trap. Every order they followed, every procedure they trusted, failed. They faced an army that broke every expectation, one that vanished when attacked, reappeared from impossible directions, and fought without revealing emotion. It eroded morale faster than bullets. When General Hyakutake received the final Guadalcanal reports, he refused to believe them. He blamed cowardice and fever for the defeats. Yet months later, on New Britain, the pattern repeated. American patrols struck supply lines and command posts with surgical accuracy. Radio intercepts captured one desperate transmission from a Japanese captain. "We fight ghosts who have learned war better than men." That phrase would later be cited in Allied intelligence briefings as the perfect summary of the campaign. Behind that haunting reputation stood an industrial miracle. American factories supplied not only the weapons but also the mindset, a machine that learned as it fought. From field memos to blueprints, from broken rifles shipped back for analysis to new rations tested on islands, the United States waged a war of learning. Every failure became an improvement. Every improvement turned into a new form of fear for the enemy. The Japanese soldiers never faced ghosts. They faced engineers, radio operators, chemists, and mechanics who had transformed ordinary infantry into phantoms of precision. But by the time they realized it, their belief had become their reality, and belief, in the jungle, could kill faster than bullets. By 1945, the Japanese command no longer feared American soldiers, they feared the jungle itself. Every rustle, every distant echo off steel, or whisper of boots was enough to send entire platoons firing wildly into the darkness. The Imperial Army, once proud of its discipline, now found itself unraveling in confusion and exhaustion. Across New Guinea, the Philippines, and Burma, the Americans were no longer merely fighting men. They were dismantling an enemy's mind. Jungle warfare had evolved into psychological warfare, and the Americans had turned nature into an accomplice. What had begun as a desperate adaptation on Guadalcanal had become doctrine, refined, taught, and perfected until the enemy's morale collapsed long before his body did. At the core of this transformation lay a brutal truth. The U.S. military had learned to fight an invisible war. Engineers, logisticians, and field scientists continued to refine every aspect of jungle combat. Lightweight machetes forged from manganese steel replaced heavier carbon versions that dulled too quickly. Jungle boots were fitted with drainage eyelets to keep feet dry. The new rations included caffeine tablets and vitamin D to counter exhaustion under the canopy. Even matches were redesigned with wax coatings to ignite after rain. These innovations may have seemed small, but each gave the soldiers a margin of survival. And survival, in this hell of humidity and disease, was victory. The Americans had transformed the jungle from an obstacle into an ecosystem of advantage. Psychological warfare deepened this advantage. On Leyte in late 1944, American forces broadcast eerie recordings at night, Japanese voices mimicking lost comrades, cries echoing through valleys, and the soft chanting of Buddhist funeral hymns layered beneath wind and rain. The tactic exploited superstition, amplifying fear in soldiers already pushed beyond endurance. Prisoner interrogations later revealed how devastating it was. One captured sergeant confessed that he no longer trusted his own senses. "When we hear voices, we shoot. But the jungle answers back. It mocks us." The Americans weren't just fighting, they were orchestrating dread. Fear itself became a weapon more precise than artillery. The results showed across the Pacific. On Mindanao, entire Japanese battalions vanished into the forest, leaving behind rifles still loaded. Their commanders found diaries filled with desperate questions. Why do they know where we are? And how do they see in darkness? For many, the psychological strain was too great. The imperial code demanded stoicism, but even the most hardened officers couldn't fight shadows forever. One account tells of a captain who, surrounded at dusk, ordered his men to fix bayonets and charge into what he believed was an encirclement, only to discover the enemy had already moved. They ran headlong into an empty clearing, firing at trees. By dawn, they were all dead, cut down by a single flanking unit that had waited in silence for hours. American commanders recognized this collapse and exploited it. General MacArthur's staff began issuing memoranda emphasizing tempo over firepower, keep pressure constant, deny the enemy sleep, and sustain the illusion of omnipresence. Small units were rotated rapidly so that Japanese troops faced new opponents daily and could never predict behavior. Reports from the 32nd Infantry Division noted that the enemy often surrendered after hearing radio transmissions in the distance, assuming an entire regiment was approaching. In reality, it was often just one patrol, whispering coordinates into the darkness. Yet victory came at a cost. The same soldiers who terrified their enemies carried the psychological scars of fighting unseen. They lived in conditions where disease killed faster than bullets. Malaria, dysentery, and trench foot decimated units as efficiently as combat. Letters home spoke of nightmares, of firing into shadows and wondering if anything had been there at all. One Marine wrote, "The jungle is a living thing. You kill men, and the forest swallows them. You sleep beside them and forget where they fell." These were not the sanitized wars of maps and orders. This was endurance by instinct, the human mind bending to survive in a world that devoured clarity. Behind every battlefield triumph stood an invisible army of workers and scientists who kept the machine alive. The engineers at DuPont refined synthetic rubber for tires and boots. Chemists at Johns Hopkins created Adaptation to suppress malaria. Designers at Boeing modified cargo planes to drop supplies into terrain where no road could reach. Even refrigeration technicians from Carrier Company improved portable cooling units so that medical plasma could last longer in tropical heat. The war was fought not only with rifles but also with refrigeration coils, chemical formulas, and logistical spreadsheets. America's ghost soldiers in the jungle had millions behind them, hands in factories, minds in laboratories, all focused on making survival possible as Japan's empire contracted. Its soldiers began to realize the terrifying asymmetry of the conflict. Their equipment rotted, their rations decayed. Ammunition shipments never arrived because American submarines had already claimed the sea. Radios failed for lack of parts. And still, from the darkness, came those quiet footsteps, the invisible hunters. A captured officer on Luzon described the hopelessness. We are being eaten alive by a machine that learns faster than we can pray. To him, the Americans were not human. They were the embodiment of inevitability. By early 1945, the tide of war had shifted entirely. American jungle divisions, now veterans of 3 years of brutal adaptation, advanced with fluid precision. Their ability to coordinate infantry, airstrikes, and artillery in dense terrain shattered the last organized resistance. The same tactics born in desperation at Guadalcanal were now guiding the reconquest of the Philippines and paving the way for the invasion of Okinawa. When Japan's surrender finally came, many of its surviving officers admitted that they never truly understood what defeated them. They had prepared for strength, but they had faced intelligence. They had trained for confrontation, but they were destroyed by invisibility. The legacy of those ghost soldiers would echo far beyond the Pacific. In the jungles of Vietnam 2 decades later, both sides studied those same doctrines: stealth, adaptation, and decentralized communication. The lessons of 1942 became the foundations of modern guerrilla warfare. Engineers refined radios into encrypted systems. Camouflage science evolved into a discipline. Even the psychological tactics, the manipulation of sound, the exploitation of fear, became standard study in military academies. The ghosts of Guadalcanal had rewritten how nations conceived of combat. Yet beneath the glory of innovation lay tragedy. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers died never understanding what they fought for. Entire regiments starved, hallucinating victory as they faded away. American soldiers, though triumphant, carried the jungle inside them for years. Many returned home unable to sleep in silence, hearing in their dreams the same distant whispers they had once used to terrify the enemy. The line between man and phantom had blurred. They had become what the war demanded, something less than visible, more than human. As the Pacific fell quiet, the jungles reclaimed their dead. Weapons rusted into soil, and uniforms decayed into moss. Only the stories remained, the diaries that spoke of ghosts and shadows, of fear that no weapon could kill. Historians later called it the Invisible War, fought not just between armies, but between ways of thinking. The Americans had proven that adaptability could defeat devotion, that science could haunt superstition, and that the mind could become the deadliest weapon of all. In the end, when peace finally came, the lesson was clear. Strength alone cannot survive without imagination. Those who adapt, who learn faster, who move silently, who merge with their world, are the ones who endure. The jungle did not choose sides. It simply rewarded those who understood. One veteran of the campaign wrote years later, reflecting on the ghosts his enemies once feared. We weren't spirits. We were men who learned to listen to the jungle better than they did. That was our secret. And in that truth lay the essence of modern warfare, not the battle of armies, but the triumph of adaptation over arrogance, of innovation over ritual, and of human ingenuity over fear itself.